What is trauma? I don't have to tell you guys what trauma is because you work with it, you breathe it, you drink it. One of my favorite things I do is, in my whole career is come to talk to you because I really believe in what you do. And I'm here to try to talk to you a bit about generational trauma. Uh, because trauma victims can be targeted based on a lot of things: economics, power, gender, race, religion. But one of the things is family of origin across generations. And that's what I'm here to do today, is to try to put a face on generational trauma and to tell you a story. One of the things I learned from hanging around you folks, you're storytellers. You tell very good stories. Some of the stories you tell over lunch are inappropriate about torture and rape, but you're excellent storytellers. So I'm here to tell you about a story that began on a road trip. It was a road trip where three men were in a car driving from Charlotte, North Carolina to Washington, D.C. to move an elderly 90-year-old great aunt out of her room, out of her apartment into assisted living. She was developing dementia. Her friends had called and told us, you have to do something about it. She cannot live alone anymore. So my uncle, myself, and my son got in a car and drove to D.C. It took 10 hours to get there, and we started off talking about sports. We talked about the weather. We talked about politics. And then someone asked a serious question. Have you ever thought about where we came from? Where did the Lyles name come from? What were our ancestors like? And all of us had always wondered that, but no one had ever verbalized it. I'm going to give you teaching points as I go through this story. And teaching point number one: victims of trauma often have many questions that they've never verbalized, need a safe environment to ask. That car, it took 7 hours. It took time. Victims of trauma will need time to feel safe. It took us that long to feel safe to really talk about something that was very painful for us to think about, because none of us were eager to investigate for fear of what we may find. But because of that conversation, the youngest person in the car was energized to find out. And that brings me to, that's my son, by the way. That brings me to my second teaching point. Safe dialogue about trauma energizes and promotes behavioral change and hope. We were able to move outside our fear and our anxiety and confront the uncertainty of what we might find if we started this journey. Because when you're working with trauma, you never know what kind of mess you're going to stumble across. But that mess has to be stumbled across if you're going to get well. So we had an advantage, or he had. I'm not the one that did this. I'm just bringing the news today, okay? Somebody else did the work. And his method was fairly unique because it was a method that started with what you know. He knew, and my Uncle Bill knew that his father had a very unique name that I will tell you about later, one that you probably never heard before. And we would work backwards in time using death certificates, census records, and historical documents to reconstruct the story. And the nice thing about being in South Carolina where this story occurs is that South Carolina was very proud of its history of slavery and has a lot of documentation. Second teaching point, a third teaching point: trauma survivors and trying to work out the history, the mess. You start with what you do know in order to find questions about what you don't know. Because a lot of times people don't remember, can't even put into words what has happened, but start where you are. It reminds me of the story of Moses. When Moses was called to lead the nation of Israel out of Egypt, he had all these excuses, and then he went into the unknown. You don't know what's going to happen, Lord. After all, I'm a criminal, and these people won't listen to me, and we're going to get out here, and all these bad things are going to happen. And the Lord said, what's in your hand? A rod. Give me what you do know about, and see what I can do with it. So that's what we did. Let's start talking about slavery. There's a proud history of slavery in South Carolina. I had a bunch of pictures that I don't have time to show you, but you find plenty of pictures of what slave masters' houses look like. There's streets, there are 3 intact plantations where I live, in the town I live in. You can see pictures of slave cabins. Now notice the difference between that and that. And that slave cabin actually looks just like the house that my father grew up in, because I've seen it before it fell apart. Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America before the Civil War, said this, that slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible in both Testaments from Genesis to Revelation. I did not capitalize Genesis and Revelation because I don't believe in, I don't know what Genesis and Revelation he was talking about. So I know I'm speaking at the American Bible Society, and you're supposed to capitalize the books of the Bible. I'm a Sunday school teacher, but I'm not capitalizing that. Teaching point, you can't have this kind of mess, this kind of systemic trauma, without systematic support from the powers that be. As Ephesians 6 says, we are fighting wickedness in high places. Well, let's go to the Lyles Plantation. The interesting thing is I can tell you a little bit about the Lyles Plantation because somebody actually wrote about it. The Lyles Plantation was featured in a book called Our Father's Fields by James Everett Kibler, who was a University of South Carolina Department of English professor. He also was at the University of Georgia at a later time and was a member of the Neo-Confederate movement in the League of the South. Folks in those groups think, there's some people that think that black folk had it good during slavery, better than today. Some of those people might be a member of the Neo-Confederate movement. Looking at his documentation, the Lyles Plantation began with Colonel John Lyles, and that's the way he spelled his name, who was a hero in the Revolutionary War. And he fought the Cherokee. I was thinking about the presentation this morning. He fought the Cherokee for the land upon which the plantation was established. He stole the land from the Cherokee that owned it. But that's not the way that story was told. He brought slaves with him during this period of time in the mid to late 1700s, but none of them had names until 1845. The first Lyles with a name was Easton Lyles in 1845, and before then they were just mentioned with cattle and horses and pigs. Names are important. Names are important. Many trauma victims have given themselves names that hurt. Sometimes you can find out a lot about a person by finding out what do people call you and what do you call yourself. He had 6 nephews, James Aramanus, who helped build the plantation, William Big Bill, Ephraim Big F. He fought with Daniel Morgan, who was a Confederate hero in the Civil War, and John, who was the person whose name was changed to the spelling that it is now in the early 1800s. Aramanus Lyles was the major builder of the plantation during that time period. He had 184 slaves, none of whom had a name. And it was located in Blair, South Carolina. Blair, South Carolina, located in there, around there, but it's in Fairfield. And the yellow part of the diagram just above the middle is Fairfield County. A river runs through it called the French Broad River, and the Lyles Plantation was located on that. This is a picture from inside the Lyles Plantation with one of my ancestors that was taking a caretaker of the woman in the wheelchair. John Lyles left it to his son Thomas. Thomas sold it to his neighbor, the Hardys. who resold it back to the Lyles. It went into disrepair and was disassembled in 1982. There's just ruins left, and in 1989 it was bought by the man who wrote the book, John Kibler, that we got all of this from. And when you look at the area now, you just see ruins, chimney ruin. But this is a grave, found a slave graveyard. Slave graveyards didn't have markers, didn't have headstones because the slaves didn't have names. You have to be a human being, I guess, to have a name, because pigs and cows and horses didn't have names. And you might not be able to tell, but the reason you knew it was a slave is because of an indentation in the ground. As you walked along, you would walk across little valleys in the ground that were the shape of a casket. And you knew underneath your feet were the remains of someone without a name. But trauma can only be buried so long. Those indentations in the ground are also reflected in indentations in the lives of the survivors that tell a story. And we're going to tell the story of these people in this generation, the people that my uncle and myself and my son were asking questions about. We're going to tell that story now. We found that the first free Lyles was a man named George. He actually was a member of the first generation that had a name. He was freed from the Lyles Plantation in Blair, South Carolina. Welcome to Blair, South Carolina. Blair is all of these stores, these pictures I'm going to show you are uninhabited buildings in the middle of nowhere that look like a ghost town. This was a merchandise shop. There was a post office that had a person that was attending the post office, because Blair is not a city or a town, it's a populated area now. It's about 300 people that live there. And when I was trying to find the Lyles Plantation, I went into the post office, and the woman looked up and said, "May I help you?" Because I was obviously a stranger, because everybody around there knew each other. And I said, "I'm looking for the Lyles Plantation where it used to be. Would you happen to know?" And she goes, "Why are you looking for the Lyles Plantation?" I said, "Because some of my ancestors came from that plantation. They were descendants of Aramanus Lyles." And she stopped, stepped back, and said, "That was my great-great-grandpa." And all of a sudden, her tone changed in that post office. They had a library that was in a garage of this house. But this is what you saw a lot of, old houses falling down that were unoccupied, because many of the slaveholders were killed in the Civil War. This was another store. Oh, I got to show you this. The next picture, I think, is just, this is the Blair Hilton. I don't know where you guys were staying for this conference, but this is 5-star. This Blair is a ghost town. Because perpetrators of trauma pay a price. Sometimes now, always later. If you walk outside the Blair Hilton and look to the left, the road runs down to a train track. On the other side of the train track is the land that began the beginnings of the Lyles Plantation. I actually got out and tried to walk up there, but the area is populated with packs of wild dogs now. And my cousin and I encountered a group of wild dogs and decided I'd rather find my car than to find that plantation that day. I found out later from the lady in the post office that it's nothing there but woods anyway. George left Blair when he was emancipated for Whitmire, and like many slaves, walked either along riverbanks or train tracks to go to different places, where he lived in a boarding house. Welcome to Whitmire, South Carolina. Financially segregated. That's what white houses looked like in Whitmire, because most of the white people had financial means. And the black houses, some of them didn't have roofs. You get to downtown Whitmire and stood in the middle of the street and look to the right, you see the railroad tracks that George walked down to get there from Blair. If you look to the left, you saw a church that George would not have been able to attend because back then and still today, one of the most segregated hours of the week is 11 o'clock on Sunday. So even though George may have left the site of his original trauma, reminders follow. Financially, he was still had just the clothes on his back. Educationally, he still did not have an education. Relational, he was still alone. And spiritually, there was still a church he could not attend, even though he was no longer on the plantation. But as the speaker before me said, revenge does not help us to get better. So George didn't seek revenge, he sought structure. And as we look a little bit later, we find George seeking structure, his new normal, if you will, by finding a job and starting a family with a woman named Cindy. It's not an accident, I think, that Dr. King's, one of his most famous speeches was, "I have a dream." Because people from trauma have dreams. Sometimes the dreams are very small. Sometimes they're afraid to dream. I'm just showing one, that's an example of a census from 1880s to show you some of the stuff we used, that my son used to do this. In the 1880 census, you find George and Cindy living in Cromer's Township, which is just west of Whitmire, working as a laborer sharecropping. And they have 4 sons, the oldest of which was James Lyles, who was 8 in 1980. Beneath the trauma and abuse, survivors still have dreams. There's an old saying, every child has a gift. Some just haven't unwrapped theirs yet. Every trauma survivor has a dream. Some just haven't unwrapped theirs yet. Jim Lyles was the first person I ever heard of in my family. Everybody in that car, we couldn't get past Jim. Every time we tried to go past Jim, the trail just went silent. We didn't know anything beyond Jim. So George was our revelation. Jim we had heard about, Clara we had heard about. That's why we knew we had this thing right, because all the dots lined up. Jim and Clara were born in the late 1800s, lived in Union County, a little bit further north. He was in the transportation business as a wagon driver, had 5 kids, the youngest of which was the person who got us started on this in the first place. His name was Strap. Have any of you ever met someone named Strap? His oldest was probably a man named Johnny. In fact, now we know the oldest was a man named Johnny because I actually met this man when I was a very small child. The verbal history on Jim Lyles was that he was paid with alcohol. No, I'm sorry, this is not the Johnny I met. The next generation is going to have a Johnny that I met. Verbal history is he was paid with alcohol for his work, became an alcoholic, and was very violent. The big story about Jim was that he was so violent that one time the horse didn't act right. He punched the horse and the horse died. When that's your heritage, that says a lot about where you come from. The fact that he developed problems with alcohol isn't new. Survivors of trauma often self-medicate their pain. Because remember, Jim only got paid with alcohol, not money, but his kids couldn't buy food with alcohol. It is also true that you see more depression, substance abuse, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in people with trauma. But the problem is, for many trauma victims, it's not post-traumatic stress disorder because the trauma never ended. Jim and Clara lived later in the 1920 census in Spartanburg, working as a wagon driver, had 2 sons, Strap, and 2 daughters. And Clara died, but her death certificate gave us an answer to the big question. Why did they name their kid Strap? Her maiden name was Dawkins, and her father's name was Strap, who was an emancipated slave. So Strap Dawkins was an emancipated slave, and she named her son after her father. Now, do you name your son after your father if the father was the receiver of the strap or the giver of the strap? I think Strap Dawkins was probably someone that worked in the fields exercising discipline over the slaves with a strap. It was a source of power, and it was a source of dignity and power to do that, and thus that name was passed on. Like I said before, names mean something. Survivors of violence may equate violence with power, thus the name Strap. So far they've traveled from the middle of South Carolina up north to Spartanburg County, where Strap Sr. married a woman named Valerie. And now we're in the fourth generation, as we got George, we got Jim, third generation, Strap Sr., and my grandmother, Valerie. Census 1940, you see that they had a lot of children. They had 7 children. He worked in the family business of transportation, and the name that started the story, because we figured if we started with Strap Lyles Sr. and went backwards, we'd find something, and it worked. He also had issues with alcohol and had very bad health, and died at a very young age. When he was 42 years old. That up there? Yeah, skipped one. Yeah, he died at 42 years of age, coronary heart disease, and was buried in the cemetery with the indentations in the ground. One of those indentations was him, but they didn't have names. His son would work at the funeral home that buried him, and the informant was his brother, Johnny Lyles, who was a painter. And here, the verbal history changes in a way that's relevant to the American Bible Society, because the history of all of the men I've mentioned so far was full of trauma and pain and self-abuse and in some cases, violence. Johnny Lyles I actually met when I was a kid, my father's uncle. He was a painter who was known as a good man, a family man, and a church man. He built his house next to the church that he went to. He was generous to others. He was a father figure to the kids that were left by his brother dying at 42. But he was a role model that didn't put up with any foolishness and read the Bible a lot. The early death of Strap Lyles Sr. is a teaching point that's very clear for many of you. Trauma survivors have very poor self-care. And chronic stress is the reason that a lot of these folks die early, because chronic stress affects your adrenal glands and causes disease with your heart, your brain, your bones, your pancreas. More diabetes, more osteoporosis, more dementia, more depression, more heart disease in people that are trauma survivors. So I've taken you through 3 generations of Lyleses: George and Cindy, Jim and Clara, Strap and Valerie, and then to Generation 4, the name made another generation, Strap Jr. Strap Sr. named his son Strap Jr. Born in 1929 with the name, when I always think about the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue. Because with a name like this, you have predestined your son to a lot of specific things. He entered the military to support 6 siblings because his mother was widowed. Won a Purple Heart in Korea, but no heroes welcome when he came home. He came home to be harassed by the Klan and not able to get a job, and worked in transportation, the family business, as a truck driver. He married a nurse that many of you who were here about 2-3 years ago heard about, and was an angry black man because he was very bitter about what had happened in his life. The interesting thing is he had a deathbed conversion. He thought that God, religion, was worthless in some respects. At some parts of his life, as he got older, he began to go back to church. And when he was dying on his deathbed, a man came to visit him. He wouldn't listen to anything I had to say because I was just a young boy that didn't know anything about life because I had not lived like him. A man came to visit him who put me out of the room, walked in, and led my father to Christ. That man was the son-in-law of Johnny Lyles, the painter, the good man who read the Bible to his nephews. Teaching point. Trauma survivors are best understood in context, and those trauma survivors need a trustworthy friend. This is a testimony to the power of an individual witness. Each of you are so important. Your lives are impacting people. Johnny Lyles, the painter, raised a daughter who would marry a man who became such an outstanding Christian that he would later lead my father to Christ. You are important. You have no idea what the plan is that God has for you that might break generational trauma. Because what he did broke 4 generations of trauma. And that generation, that 4th generation, really had quite the story. Notice something. All these people died very young. I have outlived 2 of the people on that list already at 62. Because life ends very early for trauma survivors, and it's not just in years. Because sometimes people leave the site of the trauma, but it does not die for 4 generations. Let's talk about the rest of the story. Strapp Sr., my grandfather, had 4 sons. 3 of them became deacons in their churches. 2 were very vocal about their salvation experiences, very, very vocal about the fact that that's what turned them around. And they said, not me, that trauma in their lives began to die because of what had happened in their lives. They would no longer become people who just drank their pain away. They would no longer be people who were prone to yelling and screaming and at times maybe becoming violent. They had seen that, done that, and they wanted to do something different, and 2 of the 3 became very active deacons, and 1 was a deacon, not as active, but 2 became leaders of their churches. Teaching point. The human spirit, no matter how much you try to traumatize someone, is ultimately resilient when united with the Spirit of God. And I like what somebody said earlier. Healing takes place in community. These men got well because of the churches they were in and the healing that occurred in community with other people. So I've told you about 4 generations of trauma. But because of Christ, generation 4 changed the script. They got a new start because if any man is in Christ, he's a new creature. They got a new mind because Romans 12 talks about a new way of thinking. Psalm 27 talked about a new hope. I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord when I couldn't get a job that paid me fairly and when I couldn't shop or eat where I should have been able to shop. And Psalm 37 says that even if I might stumble, I will not be utterly cast down because the hand of the Lord God will always uphold me. The good news applies to trauma. For 3 generations, it was almost like the woman in the Bible that said, "Oh Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." For these generations, I wonder how George, Jim, Strapp Sr.'s family said, "Oh Lord, if you had been here." Strapp Jr., "Oh Lord, if you had been there." An answer finally came when Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he was dead, yet shall he live." And generation 4 proved it. So trauma did leave the survivors of the plantation, presented by generation 5, researched by generation 6, and this is just raw selfishness, dedicated to generation 7. And because of God, he will not have to live the kind of trauma that lived on the plantation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Wonderful. Try to keep your comments brief if you can, because they allow others to have something an opportunity. Just my comment as we're coming up, I hear this thing about name. Dorothy's employees are not defined by their trauma. They're the manager of this company. And Michael's, comments about name and, just being like cattle, sheep, and pig. I hate him to even hear those words being said, but Then thinking of Isaiah 62, about when Christ redeems us, or Israel, no longer will they call you deserted, or your name or your land desolate, but you will be called Hephzibah, and your land Beulah, for the Lord will take delight in you, and your land will be married. So even this beautiful thing of God renaming us, and the new name we'll get in Revelation, it's beautiful. Okay, we have Heather.
My question is for you, Dr. Lyles, actually. So I'm white, in case you can't tell. Just to be very clear. My name's Heather Drew, by the way. I didn't introduce myself last time I asked a question. But I just wanted to ask, as a person who has my color skin, and I'm trying to engage in a reconciliation that will make lasting impact to break the cycle, it's really important for us to understand as white people how to have this dialogue well. And I think your point about people who have trauma need safe places to ask questions. As a therapist, I understand that, to sort of like not take these questions personally, but I would love to hear a little bit more about what you would recommend about how these dialogues take place and how those questions can be asked safely and how they can be received safely.
Yesterday, the reason I was not here for the whole conference is this is spring break where I am, and I have a lot of students that come back from college to come see me. It's the only time they can do it, so I had to work part of the week. And yesterday I was seeing a patient, an African-American woman that sees a white therapist. She was 40 years old and she was single, and she was complaining about how she had never been, and she was a professional person, and she said, I've never been able to find anybody to marry. And I've started seeing a therapist to talk about it. And she told me the therapist was, I said, is the therapist white or black? She goes, the therapist is white. I said, have you talked about this with your therapist? She goes, yes. And I said, have you talked about the possibility of dating somebody white with your therapist? And she said, yes. So I said, you guys have talked about race? She goes, believe it or not, yes. Because one of my professors once told me, I said, you got a good therapist. Because one of my professors told me that it is harder to talk about race than it is to talk about anything else when I was in training. People think it's hard to talk about sexual issues. Talking about race is the hardest thing of all. And because people on both sides get very uncomfortable, become very defensive, and it doesn't become a real interchange. Remember in that car when we were driving to DC, none of us really wanted to talk about this. All three of us. We were very uncomfortable with it. We talked about everything else until we had enough safety to talk about this. So if you develop a relationship with someone just to talk about race, it won't work. You have to find a way to initiate a contact about something else to develop the relationship, and then you can talk about race. Years ago, one of my jobs was I went around teaching doctors how to use new medicines, and sometimes that sent me into some very interesting places in the South. One place was Pulaski, Tennessee, the home of the Ku Klux Klan. The company that sent me in, when they found out that I was going to Pulaski, wanted to find somebody else because they thought I might get lynched. So they said, well, you can't just drive there. I tell you what, we'll have a drug rep meet you and take you there. So I said, I'm going to do better with a white woman picking me up, taking me into Pulaski. So we ditched that one very quickly. But I walk into a room full of white doctors whose parents were the epitome of the Lyles Plantation people. And they looked at me like this, and they had some food out. And I looked at them, I said, what kind of barbecue is this? Is it dry, or what kind of sauce do you put on? We started talking about barbecue. Then we talked about fishing. Then we talked about stock car racing. And then we got to talk about their patients, most of whom were black, and what it was like treating people of a different color. But it has to start with something else. You have to have a real relationship in order to have a real dialogue. So find something that you can talk about you have in common. If I can find something in common with those guys in Pulaski, Tennessee, there's hope for everybody.
Good morning. My name is Ernie. On our table, we had the following question. Maybe we missed it. But our question was, which then generation confronted the generational trauma? Was it the fifth or the sixth?
The answer was both. The answer was both, because in that car was the fourth, it had been the fourth, fifth, and sixth, yeah, because Uncle Bill was my father's brother. And all three of us were asking questions about it. And none of us had dealt with it really until we began this process of unearthing those indentations in our past that didn't have a name and didn't have a sign or marker. And so it was really 3 generations that began the process of dealing with it. Because remember, somebody said earlier, healing occurs in community, not isolation. It took 3 generations to deal with this properly.
Wow.
Done with me?
No, I'm not done with you. I'll never be done with you. I guess one thing that strikes me as similar between Carol Bremer Bennett's and your presentation is the amount of time it takes. Like, even though you don't want to think about it, when you're willing to, the time to do all that research of what happened and the difficulty of grieving or dealing with things that you don't have a name for, you don't even know what it was. Can you talk about that? You got anything to say about that?
That it took time. It took time talking about the process of doing it. Do we really want to find out? Do we really want to go there? How are we going to deal with what we find? When I piled everybody I was telling the people at my table, I went to Blair twice. The first time was with my cousin when we got chased away by dogs. The second time was with my whole family at the time. All of my kids, my son's wife, my wife and I piled in a van and went there the day after Thanksgiving, and that's when we met the lady at the post office and got a tour of the whole area. But my family was very reluctant to go and was scared to death of what we would find. So it was a process. It was a process. That was really a 2-year process.
Yeah, yeah. And it's worth it, right?
Yeah.
It's worth taking the time.
It's like therapy.
Yep.
It takes time.
We got Karine there. Oh, time, yes, Karine. We don't have time, but we have time for you, Karine.
Thank you. I wonder if you could address the issue of anger in the African American community, discovering some of these generational traumas, and also speaking about that relational, because I find that that's an issue where a lot of those anger just boils up, and there is no safe place for people to have those discussions.
Yeah, it's an anger issue and a trust issue. When I went to the second time for my family, the tour guide that showed us around mentioned that the white Lyleses and the black Lyleses get together every other year for a barbecue in another town because nobody lives there anymore, and we like to come. And my wife said, I don't know if I want to come back here again. I don't know if I trust these people that much to be out in the middle of nowhere with the descendants of slaveholders. So even that process unearthed feelings. But again, there has to be a safe place to talk about it, a safe place to process it. And I wish our churches were those safe places. But sometimes our churches are part of the problem.